good to go.
Sounds good. All right, y'all. First of all, I want to thank y'all for taking the time and getting on our CDN membership meeting. This is our second virtual meeting this year. We had one last month, kind of going over a brief overview of the CDN and what we do and everything. So with this being our second webinar, the strategy that the steering committee laid out in response to COVID was to kind of do a few webinars focused on different topics. Like I said, the first one was the brief overview of the CDN, and this second one and the next couple meetings we're going to be looking at are going to be focused on desired force conditions for wildlife. This topic was really brought to us during our 2019 CDN membership survey that we sent out asking for areas of interest and training. There was a very strong interest expressed for bottomland hardwood management, especially in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So in the months ahead, the steering committee we're shifting our focus more from working ag lands with the terminal workshops to a focus on desired forest conditions for wildlife. With that, the steering committee has identified a three-pronged approach for the CDN's DFCW focus. The first is going to be today's webinar, which will include a background and overview presentation by Duck Lacasio. We're also going to have some examples of practical application of DFCWs on public ground by Drew Green, private ground by Jeff Denman, and then Randy Childress is going to wrap us up with some WRE force management that's going on in the MAV. The second approach that we had was kind of relying on the forest guilds, or the Forest Stewards Guild. They had tentatively planned a infield desired forest conditions workshop in October in the Arkansas-Mississippi Alluvial Valley. The steering committee is looking forward to this workshop because we believe it's going to be a great on-the-ground DFCW information and educational opportunity. And we are hoping for a strong CDN participation and support for that training exercise. However, that workshop has been postponed until the first half of 2021. And me and Steve and the other steering committee members, we will be keeping y'all informed as far as when those workshops or when that workshop is planned, and kind of as it gears up and gets ready for that. The third area of interest that we had was also planning our theme for our February 2021 membership meeting. We're planning on diving a little bit deeper into the DFCWs and forest management in the MAV. And the steering committee, we do have a kind of a light agenda right now as far as what we're going for, but we're planning on fleshing that agenda out at our next steering committee meeting that'll be later this fall. So a few housekeeping items to bring up before we get started with the presentations today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of all the presentations. We ask that if you do have any questions, we'll hold them to this time, and we're just going to have an open forum. You are more than welcome to unmute yourself at the end and ask your question, or you can write it in the Zoom group chat box. So if you drag your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see several little buttons that pop up right down there, and there's one as a chat. You can just click on it, type your question in there, and Steve and I will be monitoring that, and we'll make sure that those questions get answered at the end of our session today. I'd also like to ask everybody to go ahead and make sure that your microphone is muted. Ron Zeiss is going to go ahead and mute everybody, but we'll have it where you can unmute yourself at the end and ask your question. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And our first presentation today is by Duck Lacasio, who's with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And he's going to give us a background and overview of desired forest conditions for wildlife.
Hi guys, thank you. Everybody see, is my screen up and everybody can see it?
Yes.
All right. So my presentation today is going to be on wildlife forestry in the lower Mississippi Valley, or you could call it managing towards desired forest conditions for wildlife. Before we get into DSCs though, I'd like to first discuss where they came from, how it began, to where you get a better understanding of the story. Many of you are familiar with JVs. Most folks on this call are members of the lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, but indulge me for a minute to remind everybody what the JV is, because even though I'm a member, sometimes I forget what they do. It's a self-directed, non-regulatory conservation partnership that exists for the purpose of implementing the goals and objectives of national and international bird conservation plans. Their geography is, of course, the MAV, but also West Gulf Coastal Plain, Ozarks. With the purpose of implementing the objectives of national and international bird conservation plans, you would assume there'd be direct implication for restoration and management of bottomland hardwood forests in MAV. So we look back to understand where DSCs came from. There's been a long history of forest management in the MAV, but rarely have managers talked the same lingo. Rarely were their prescriptions explicitly written and linked to wildlife habitat needs. In 2001, National Refuge System initiated biological reviews, and they realized very quickly that biologists and foresters talk two different languages. Biologists would say something like, look, you know, we're lacking in Swainson's habitat. Foresters need to know what that looks like. Biologists couldn't really explain what that looked like. Then in 2002, USDA NRCS asked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to assist in managing these large remnant blocks of bottomland hardwood forests that were being enrolled in wetland reserve program with an emphasis on wildlife habitat. From that, a joint workshop in Vicksburg happened there in November of 2002, and a working group was formed to draft a white paper to address forest management as it related to wildlife habitat. Here, managers began to describe things in terms of canopy cover and basal area. This white paper subsequently resulted in what I have up here, Forest Land Compatible Use Guidelines, NRCS WRP Forest Land Compatible Use Guidelines. This you could think of as version 1 of desired forest conditions, right? Now all of a sudden, we're biologists, foresters, we're all talking, you know, things like basal area and present vines and canopy cover and ground cover. Also in 2004, at the same time, the LMV-JV Management Board created an interagency interdisciplinary group to further investigate and address forest management as it relates to enhancing wildlife habitat. That group was the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group. The task assigned read this: the group would strive to ensure that conservation actions and programs of the JV partners reflected reforestation and forest management prescriptions and practices that sustain populations of priority birds and other forest-dependent wildlife in concert with sustainable forestry. It was a group of professionals that when you combined all the foresters, biologists, managers, and researchers that were invited to be in this working group, we had all the disciplines needed to fulfill those tasks assigned by the JV. The first tangible product from that group was a report, Restoration, Management, and Monitoring of Forest Resources in the MAV, Recommendations for Enhancing Wildlife Habitat. This collaboration would later just become known as a DFC document or DFCW document. And those of us who are still lucky enough to have hard copies, that's what the cover of it looks like. And I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have a copy of it there in their office. It was peer reviewed and published in 2007. You know, CFWA's Forest Resource Technical Committee reviewed it, Partners in Flight, DU, NRCS Arkansas, Arkansas Forest Commission, and several others. So it was peer reviewed and turned out there for us to start using. So from 2007 to now, it's basically looked like this. And the contents included overviews of the MAV, overviews of priority wildlife species and habitat objectives, management of bottomland hardwood forests, restoration of bottomland hardwood forests, evaluation and monitoring, recommendations, and conclusion. I'm going to go ahead and work through each of these sections, but for this group, we're not going to discuss the MAV. All of us work in the MAV, and we know the condition and plight and problems we face in the MAV. So we'll get into priority wildlife species and habitat objectives. Because it was a report requested by the JV, and their whole deal is priority birds. It's no surprise that priority birds kind of take the forefront. However, things like bats, bears, reptiles, and amphibians were also included in this report as priority wildlife species. The habitat needs for all these species or groups of species were determined, and forest metrics were determined for each group. So for bats, large cavities happen to be that forest metric most important when they did, literature reviews and looking at these life history needs of these species. For bears, large cavities, dense ground cover, hard and soft mass. Those are the attributes important for black bear. Of course, downwoody debris, very important for herbs. For resident waterfowl like wood duck, hard mass, soft mass, cavities are important. For your disturbance-dependent songbirds, the cavities for some, structural complexity for most all of those. And then of course, an example, American woodcock, dense understory, nice lush understory is the attribute that's most important for that species or that suite of species that goes along with that American woodcock. So many of the habitat requirements of these priority wildlife species or species groups, it was realized that it could be satisfied by manipulating canopy cover and basal area. Being, the foresters in the group realized that, hey, BA and canopy cover, those are the variables that most influence forest structure and therefore wildlife habitat, right? That tells us how much light is going to make it through the canopy. These variables became the drivers of DFCWs and became primary factors. So when you open that manual, there's two tables, and it's pretty simple. There's primary factor table, and there's a secondary factor table. We'll talk about these primary factors, which are canopy cover and basal area. Those are the two kind of main important ones. That mid-story cover is going to kind of come along for the ride most of the time. Whatever you do to that canopy, it'll result in what's going to happen in that mid-story. Sometimes you might have to manage some shade-tolerant, pole size, pole class type timber. And then tree stocking in this table was used because some of the early critics, or not critics, but folks putting this together didn't have a really good feel for basal area. They had a better feel for tree stocking. So tree stocking is added here. Myself, I rarely look at it. I always think in along the lines of basal area. As a reminder, we're talking about population sustainability for all these species and species groups that we're trying to manage for. And that takes both landscape quality and site quality. Right now, we're talking site quality. We'll get to landscape quality in just a second. But at the site quality, stand level, you want a canopy. The target, DFCW, is a 60 to 70% canopy cover. So you're going to allow 30 to 40% light to come through that canopy. That will mostly result in a mid-story of 25 to 40% coverage in the mid-story. Your basal area on most MAV bottomland hardwood sites of average site quality, the basal area target is going to be 60 to 70 square feet per acre. If you think about it, that's those stands where fully stocked is going to be around, 100, 110 on the really high side. So we're bringing it down by about 30%, just to get an idea and kind of get it in your head. And then each of these tables, the primary and the secondary one that I'll get to in a second, have these conditions that may warrant management. And that's when they get outside of that targeted stand level condition. So if canopy cover is greater than 80%, might want to do something. It's not in DFCs, might want to do something. If basal area is greater than 90 square feet per acre on an average site index type stand, then you might want to do something. Then for those attributes that couldn't be simply addressed by manipulating BA and canopy cover, a set of secondary factors were developed based on the needs of individual species, such as dominant trees for cerulean warblers, or snags, meaning small cavities for things like prothonotary warblers. And here's a secondary table. This is the only other table in the book, in the manual. or in the report. And it discusses dominant trees. The desired condition would be 2 or more per acre. Understory cover of 25 to 40%. Here's a pretty important one. Advanced intolerant, shade intolerant regeneration. We'd like to see 30 to 40% of the area, of the area that's in desired forest conditions. We'd like to see 30 to 40% of that having shade intolerant regeneration, right? That's that next stand coming on. Coarse wooded debris, 200 cubic feet, 4 or more small cavities per acre, 1 large cavity per acre. And then standing dead or stressed trees, that's those standing snags or those trees that are kind of falling apart on you. You want, if they're small, if it's a stand of poles, then you need 6 or more per acre. If it's big timber, pretty stuff, older age class stuff, then if you have 20-inch material out there, then 2 per acre is plenty enough. And then just as the primary factors, you have conditions that may warrant management, and those are just triggers if they get above or below outside of those primary desired stand conditions. So we talked about stand level. Now we're going to talk more about landscape level, because to address that population sustainability, that's a function of both landscape and site quality. So looking at the landscape side, the report addresses that by making recommendations based on the life history needs of the priority wildlife species. And based on those, remember, we're talking disturbance dependent wildlife here. It's no surprise that at the landscape scale, the target would be 70 to 95% of your forest being actively managed. Conversely, 5 to 30% can be passively managed. Passively managed are oftentimes your natural areas, your research controls, set-asides, those kind of places. We would like to see no more than 10% of it in a regenerating forest, and we'd like to see no more than 5% in a shrub-scrub forest. Now remember, this is utopia. This is what we're striving towards. We understand that there's a lot of landscapes that have a lot more shrub-scrub, a lot more regenerating forests, like a WRP property, right? But this is the target. This is what you want to move the stand to. In that case, it might take 80 years to get there. If it's a degraded forest, heavily cut, degraded forest, but it's a forest, it might be 2 or 3 or 4 treatments in, 40 years later, and you've achieved this. So, and we'll get into a little bit more of that as I go along. So the next thing is management of bottomland hardwood forests. Now we're going to kind of get into the meat and potatoes on the ground type stuff. The first thing I like to hit on is now we're going to talk about wildlife forestry, and that is managing on thirds. I just spent 10 minutes describing DFCWs, actually what it is, the nuts and bolts. Now I'm going to tell you we only want 1/3. The recommendation is to have no more than 1/3 of your landscape, of your WMA, your refuge, your land holding, private land holding that you're working with a private landowner. You only want 1/3 of it at any one time in those conditions, right? Because we're managing for a lot of different species and suites of species that need, a pretty diverse habitat. 1/3 of it needs to be within DFCs. We like 1/3 growing into DFCs. So recently treated with some type of timber treatment, mechanical timber treatment mostly, some type of timber sale. And it's going to be cut harder than that target of DFCs, and then it'll have time to grow into DFCs. Therefore, you're providing a little bit earlier successional, more light hitting the ground, bigger patches to open, right? For those species that need it. It moves into DFCs for that group of species that need that type of habitat. And then the last third, habitat that warrants management or has grown out of DFCs or something you just hadn't got to yet, right? More dark forest, closed canopy, open understory, more Acadian flycatcher, red-eyed vireo type habitat. So you kind of think of it in that regard, operating on thirds. Of the third in DFCW condition, we want to strive towards structurally diverse forests that are diverse in species, diverse in age, diverse in diameter distribution, with all those associated secondary factors that we talked about. Dominant trees, the regeneration, shade intolerant regen, the coarse woody debris, the cavities, the standing live, and the dead snags. And this picture, if you just glance at it real quick, that, I shot this from the air on a health flight check. And if you look at it, you can look at the various shades of green. That's multiple species. And it's had a timber sale, maybe 5 years, 6 years before this picture was taken. So I cut it hard. It's grown into DFCs. It's got some canopy gap. It's still light hitting the forest floor. It's going to have a decent understory, a decent mid-story, and that break in the canopy, it's good structural diversity. That's kind of what we're looking for. All right, so another important principle that I want to go over today is that there's no silver bullet prescription. All the silvicultural tools are used to manage towards DFCs. Oftentimes I get asked, well, what's a DFC cut look like? Or what's a DFC prescription look like? Well, there's no such thing. It's whatever the practitioner, the forester, the biologist, the land manager wants to do to move a stand towards DFCs. Here's 4 examples, 4 different types of treatments that I just happen to use on a wildlife management area. It's used on private land, used everywhere. Sometimes it's used to move a stand towards DFCs, these treatments are. Sometimes it's not. In this case, I was always trying to move these stands towards desired forest conditions using these various treatments. The first one, top left, that's an individual tree selection. That's often used when you have a nice well-stocked stand, relatively uniformed in distribution. It's good quality. You got multiple species. It might generally, sometimes, a lot of times, they're a younger stand. All they need is a general crown thinning. Free up some growing space, move that pulpwood into saw timber material, and put a little light on the ground, increase that structure, vertical structure and horizontal structure. That's all it needs is a thinning. If it's low quality and species diversity is low, timber species diversity is low, especially in older stands, then you would thin a lot heavier. It's still an individual tree selection type thinning. You just thin heavier. You're trying to establish regen or release regen if it's already present. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a shelter wood type harvest. Now, that's used to regenerate stands, right? Textbook definition of shelter wood is a regeneration technique. In the classic case, it's used to advance regeneration that's already there, and then you're going to come back after you release it, and you advance it on up, you come back and take the overwood off. That's a classic case. In kind of the wildlife forester case that we often use, a lot of folks in MAV, they'll do this type of treatment if they have a low quality overstory. In this case, there was a little bit of, that was a clear cut one. It had some ice damage. This one was just a low quality. It had been high graded. It was maybe made up of 3 or 4 species. Species diversity was low, but they had a pretty good bit of nuttall regeneration and green ash regeneration in the understory and midstory. So it was decided to use a shelter wood type cut. We left about 15 to 20 trees per acre, and we used it to release that regeneration. It was already present and competitive, and we will leave this wood indefinitely, the overwood. So unlike the classic case of a shelter wood where you would remove that overwood, we're going to leave it. Their way, you end up with a kind of a 2-layer canopy, and you're providing that structural diversity, and you're also providing some emergent trees. So those trees you left, and we marked to leave it, we marked that timber, so we made sure we left some that had some large cavities, some that were kind of vine laden, always choosing the better crowns, right? So that's kind of a classic example of shelter wood for wildlife. In going clockwise in the lower right-hand corner, that's a group selection type harvest. This was just pure groups. You see the shear in there, he's cutting a hole. Most of the time, these holes are going to could be as small as a 1/4 acre, could be as large as 5 acres. But you're doing that when the habitat and the stand conditions are generally good, but the structural diversity might be limited. And these groups will provide nice patches of early sessional habitat. And of course, where you prescribe these groups, you're going to have some regeneration present that you're trying to release. You wouldn't just, I generally don't prescribe them willy-nilly. We often do in WRP when we do groups on WRP easements and do some pre-commercial thinning. That's where we, after just that structural increase that structural diversity. But in a mature stand, get out there, put some leather on the ground, find those patches of advanced regeneration that can be released. So you're releasing advanced regeneration and providing that early sessional habitat, makes primo turkey nesting habitat. And then just adjacent to it in the uncut, unthinned portion of that stand, there's gonna be some excellent brood habitat. Same way with fawning cover and escape cover for deer, diurnal woodcock habitat, and on and on. And then the last example I have here is that's a straight up clear cut, and a lot of folks don't think we clear cut or think clear cutting is off limits. Remember, we don't want any more than about 5% of our landscape in early successional shrub scrub if we can help it. But sometimes a clear cut is absolutely warranted to move a stand towards DFCs, and that's often the case when you have very low stocking or very poor quality overstory, and it's time to regenerate that stand. You basically cannot thin your stand towards DFCs if you're not starting with at least some decent product out there on the landscape. If it's a really low quality overstory and the stocking's low, you have no choice but to regenerate that stand. And oftentimes, clear cut method is going to be the method that you want to do. It's oftentimes used to release advanced regeneration under a low quality overstory, but it's also can be used for a species conversion. And that's what this is an example of. There was no understory. This was a sugarberry stand. If you look at the picture, those lime green tops in the uncut is sugarberry. As you get closer to that bayou, you started picking up a little bitter pecan and a little bit of overcup. But if you see that lead, that corridor left between those two clear cuts, you see all the crowns are all the same color. It was a pure sugarberry stand, like 90% sugarberry, a little bit of overcup, a little bit of locust, a stray water hickory every now and again. Had a lot of ice damage. The overstory was really poor. It's a shade tolerant overstory with a shade tolerant understory, young sugarberry continually coming up underneath. And the diversity was very, very, very poor. So it was decided just to clear cut it and use artificial regeneration, replant. We replanted it to, probably 9 or 10 different species, all the likely candidates for that soil type and that elevation. And now it's a more mixed hardwood stand, albeit a young stand. But that was the only way to move that piece of property towards DFCs was to actually liquidate and get rid of the overstory. Hence, a clear cut was warranted. So, just to kind of reiterate, all the silvicultural tools are used by forest managers to manage a stand towards these primary factors, and that's the nuts and bolts. And I'm really making it real simple because for me to understand things, I have to dumb them down. And as a land manager, if I know this is the target, this is my table, I can use any tool I have to move towards these conditions. And these conditions are a canopy cover of 60 to 70%, mid-story 25 to 40%, basal area 60 to 70 square feet per acre. While I'm doing that, I'm making sure I have an understory of 25 to 40% and have shade intolerant regeneration at least on a third of that stand. All the time thinking about, whenever I'm marking, thinking about those small cavities that need to be retained, thinking about those snags that need to be retained, thinking about those large cavities for black bear and bats, leaving those tall emergent trees when we run across them, those suckers that have just been, and sometimes they're wolf trees, but if they're big and they're hollow, no need to take them down, leave them for a cerulean warbler to set up a territory. Those trees that stick out like popsicles above the rest of the canopy are very important. And of course, that coarse woody debris. Now, sometimes it's not important, the coarse woody debris, because you have a lot of it. You need 200 cubic feet per acre. That's about, if you think about it, I went and measured it. It's about 3 skidder loads of wood. And if you can imagine that scattered over an acre, that's a lot of times in our bottomland hardwood systems, we have it. Depending on the flood regime, sometimes, your floods carry it off. Where I always have to worry and think about coarse woody debris is when we do have a thinning job. A lot of these contractors, they might show up with a whole tree chipper, and now all of a sudden I'm not retaining those tops. So So you might have to do something to keep it. We actually thinned a plantation once on Washita WMA, whole tree chipping operation. And we kind of dropped the ball because we forgot about the coarse woody debris. We kind of forgot that it's all leaving. You know, we're not going to be holding on to any tops. So something to always think about. So the principles, and again, some of these are new, some of these I've already showed you slides, but there's no, first one I hadn't discussed yet is no rotation or cutting cycle. So in even age management, you know, pine management, you're always thinking of this rotation. When's that final harvest going to happen? Thin final harvest, right? This is rather a 10 to 15 year entry schedule. You enter the stand. Does it fall in DFCs? If it does, great. Walk away. Move into the next stand. If it's not in DFCs, is a 30-year landscape in desired forest conditions? If not, then you need to take advantage of doing some treatment in this one. If over 30% of your landscape is in DFCs, well, maybe you don't, or maybe you cut a little harder to get it into that you know, more light hitting the ground type condition. Primary and secondary factors are averaged across the stand. So those two tables that I showed you, that's not for every acre. If we had it on every acre, it would end up very, very homogeneous. And the first couple of treatments that I did following DFCs, I did exactly that. I was so worried about reaching those targets that as I marked timber, I marked it to just below that target to where it could grow into it. Did that part right. Only thing is every acre looked the same. So when we turn, you know, I come back 5 years later, it's very, very homogeneous. What we really want is a very heterogeneous type stand to have that structural diversity. So think about it. Jeff Denman always talks about 3 to 5 acres, a 3 to 5 acre average. Think about managing little 3 to 5 acre units as you're marking timber. You kind of hit it really hard for 3 to 5 acres, then you lighten up for 3 to 5. Maybe walk through 3 to 5 acres. When it's all said and done and you average that entire stand, your average, you want it to fall within those primary and secondary factors. That table that I showed you. To attain desired stand conditions, disturbance is required. That's pretty straightforward. We're talking about disturbance dependent wildlife. If we all manage, I know all the state and federal guys on this call, we all manage big blocks of timber in the MAV that are surrounded by agriculture. If we're waiting and we're managing disturbance dependent wildlife, if we're waiting for a tornado to hit that block of timber, we'd be waiting a long time, right? Tornadoes are heading to that trailer park anyway. It's on us to get out there with heavy equipment to provide that disturbance. Multiple treatment entries are often necessary to achieve DFCs. Kind of went over this. Whether you're talking about a young stand like a WRP plantation or an older stand that's been high graded, rarely are you just going to write one prescription, walk in there with a paint gun, and when you're done walking out, it's going to be DFCs overnight. Most of the time it's going to take several entries. You know, it might take 30 years to move a stand with 3 entries to move a stand into DFCs. It all depends on what you start with. If you're blessed with some really good quality stuff, then yeah, one entry and you can reach DFCs, but oftentimes we aren't with the timber that we're managing in the MAV. There's no definitive silvicultural prescription that exists to guide a stand towards DFCs. And I'll just go into the second one. Kind of the reason why is because all the silvicultural tools are available to the land manager to manage a stand towards DFCs. So we've had some successes since 2007 when this report went out. NRCS, as members of the JV, have adopted recommendations of the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group to manage all the WRP enrolled properties towards DFCs. DU has adopted recommendations to manage their DU easements in the MAV. Louisiana Department of Wildlife Fisheries, Arkansas Game and Fish, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have adopted these recommendations for managing all WMAs and refuges in MAV. And also many private landowners have embraced DFCs. And one example would be the Mississippi River Landowner Alliance. That's a group of guys that we actually did some workshops right outside of Greenville on some large hunting clubs in the Delta. And this group was so enamored by this type of management because it was wildlife focused management that they started talking to neighboring clubs and an alliance was formed basically the alliance was formed to provide a forum to communicate timber and habitat management. The group is presently up to 50 hunting clubs, encompasses 300,000 acres. Since 2009 to present, we've had 14 workshops, excuse me. That's for private landowners. We've had workshops for consultants. We've had workshops for federal staff and for state staff. There's been some criticism over that since 2007. Some consultants, especially even age guys, consultants that kind of have even age systems in their brain, and it's a little hard to wrap your brain around uneven age. And I was one of those for the longest time, had a little bit of issue with it. So it took some workshops to explain this on the ground. And also forest academia had a little issue on how we don't necessarily always use the textbook forestry definitions of these silvicultural treatments properly. And so the solution to that was to go ahead and revise the document. So we hadn't had a revision since 2007. We know we have some definitions and some wordage that we need to change to make it a better document. And we also we have some additions that we'd like to make to that document. So this is that same slide I showed you, and with the yellow, and this is going to be my last slide for today. The yellow is just going to show you what we plan on doing. So this is going forward. That priority wildlife species and habitat section, we want to add a game species. We want to add game species. It's very non-game driven, but because we're using this document to outreach to a lot of hunting clubs now, there's no reason not to add some game species. We all know we're managing for wildlife. It doesn't matter if it's if you can hunt it or not. We're managing for wildlife across our landscapes. In the management section, we want to add a section on managing young stands, because a lot of landowners and a lot of practitioners out there are starting to deal with these younger plantations that are moving up into a getting ready to be thinned and need some direction. So we're going to have a young stand management section. We're also going to add a section on economics, and then lastly, in the evaluation and monitoring session, we're gonna include the tools for assessing and treating reforested bottomland hardwood stands on WREs. We're gonna include that decision support tool. So with that, that's kind of the end. I held it to 32 minutes. I'm 2 minutes over, and let's go ahead and move right into the next one, and we'll take questions at the very end. Thank you.
Sounds good, Doug. Thank you. All right, Drew, you're up.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Looking good.
All right. So Duck really set me up for success here. Basically most of my presentation is going to be about how we are answering those questions and how we are at the Game and Fish coming up with a way to make our management decisions better, and how to assess the health of our forest, and how can we determine whether our DFC treatments were successful or not. So, well, there we go. Basically, this is a list of our habitat program staff. Rob Willie being the habitat coordinator, and Michael Gregory being the assistant habitat coordinator. But everybody on this list has had some form of input onto this process that we've gone through to come up with all this. A brief introduction as to what we're doing. I know a lot of the guys that are on this call have experience with the GTR cluster plots and the health assessment for the GTR cluster plots. What we've done is expanded that and using it on all of our bottomland hardwoods as well as our GTRs, but we've laid it out on a grid system with 6.4 by 6.4 chains for the spacing. Well, All these points are now permanent plots. Lauren Green set up all of our plots and built it as a permanent plot system all the way across the state. So we have plots, a permanent plot system on all of our WMAs all the way across the state, with each plot having its own unique number. That way we can come back to those plots over and over again and get, at least, granted they're not pinpoint to the exact location, but we can at least go back to the general area and get similar data. Just a quick rundown of what all is in what all's being collected here and reported, and then we'll go through into the actual reports. But at the plot level, they are looking at an area that is approximately 4 acres, and that's essentially what the cruiser can see from plot center. Everything that's essentially what he can visually see and make ocular estimates. We are collecting canopy closure, mid-story density, and understory coverage. The understory coverage is actually an addition to what was collected under the original GTR cluster plot stuff. Once they make it to the plot center data, they're collecting the species, diameter, forest products, the crown class, which is where that tree will fall within the hierarchy of the forest, whether it's a dominant tree, a co-dominant tree, intermediate tree, suppressed tree, etc. And then once they finish with that, they move on to the tree health. From the tree health, and then after they complete the tree health, there's a 100th acre fixed radius reproduction cruise where they are only calculating only getting trees that are above 36 inches. When they are doing the tree stress calculations from the plot center, they're looking at tree condition, which is going to be essentially a measure of, I guess it could be better called crown condition, but they're looking at the crown to see whether that is a measure of tip dieback, and it's a 1 to 4, 1 being no stress or no dieback, 2 being lower crown dieback, 3 being less than a third tip dieback, and a 4 being more than a third dieback. Epicormic branching is just a light, moderate, heavy, looking at based on percentages, looking at the bole of the tree. Bark condition is one that we have changed from what was originally done during the GTR cluster plots. It was during the GTR cluster plots, it was a factor identification scale, whereas now we have changed it to, and if I'm misstating anything, Doug and some of y'all know way more about what was actually done in the GTR cluster plots than me, but we changed that from a light, moderate to heavy scale so that it was necessary to move on with what we did to move forward. Then we also have a basal swell, which is just an absent present deal. To come up with what we did, to come up with the reports, we had to find a way for a computer program to assign a number to each tree so that we could assign basically a health number. We call that the overall health assessment. And we did that looking at the formula you see there. And to get that, we basically, as a habitat team, we all met out in the woods on several of our GTRs and basically discussed what was the most important factors and weighted them according to how we felt that it would work. And then we tested that against what we had done with the GTR data from 2014 that was collected. So we tried to make those numbers match up the best we could when we were evaluating this, and tried to use that as a scale. And from that, we came up with this scale here to assess to give each tree an individual number. And then we also felt like that there was some trees that were not being put into the near death condition that should have been. So we added an if then formula into the Excel document that would automatically put any tree that had greater than a third crown dieback or heavy bark conditions into the near death classification, which would be that 26 to 29. And then after all that, we moved on to building a monitoring protocol, and it was kind of a secondary deal that came in later, but we are doing that at a reduced plot density on areas that we have treated. We're entering those areas 3 years post harvest to do the first monitoring cruise, and we're doing that at a plot per 8 acres. We have also, on the monitoring plots we're doing all the same data that we just went over, but we're also collecting a 100th acre red oak regen plot where they are collecting all the red oak regen, including those that are less than 36 inches. So we're actually collecting those year 1 through year 3 seedlings so that we can know what is there and whether or not we're getting sufficient light to the ground or too much light to the ground to get the regen that we want. We're also collecting data from the ground cover. We're collecting percent grasses, forbs, and bare dirt, and using that. That's kind of a deal that we modified from the MBCI stuff to help answer questions in some of our uplands as well as our bottomlands about whether that ground is suitable for quail, turkey, and that sort of thing, and also give you an idea of what that area wants to grow. And then we're also collecting cavities. So any tree so the way they will collect that is when they're doing their run through and doing their tree level information, collecting their heights and DBHs. Any tree that has a cavity, there's a checkbox off to the side, and they'll check it as either a small or a large cavity. And so with that, just to kind of go through some of our goals of what we had to come up with all that, we wanted to reduce the man hours working up our data, create an inventory system that would answer as many of the DFC questions as possible, and to be able to look at the data spatially. Okay, so just to kind of, let's see if I can do this here. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we see it.
Okay.
Great Hurricane Lake GTR cruise. Nothing changed from your presentation if you were trying to go to your Excel.
Okay, nothing changed. Lovely. Okay. Let's see here. How about now?
Hey, Andrew, this is Jason. I think you have to unshare first, then find your, there you go.
We got it. Yeah, it popped up.
It popped up?
Yeah.
We got it. Okay, so here's an example of the report. So this is right here is an example of the raw data. We've got that so that it can be done spatially. And from there, just we could sit on this for an hour, but to go through a quick rundown, we've got the raw data, and then it basically breaks down by crown class. So we've got our dominant crown classes and the percent of stress. So in this one, dominant crown class, this is on the South GTR at Hurricane Lake. This particular stand 1, it breaks it down in the dominant, co-dominant, all classes, dominant, co-dominant, intermediate, slight, and then it rolls on to the next slides and the next slides and so forth. It then goes in to break it out by species. So we've got by crown class by species, all the stress levels that for that stand and for each stand going on, and then volumes by crown class. And then we've got this little handy dandy slide here that this deal, it gives us an average OHA. It's now collecting a red oak OHA for us, that because the average OHA for the stand also includes things like overcup, bitter pecan, bald cypress, the more water tolerant species. So it does kind of skew that number. So we added a red oak OHA column. It then gives us just a summary of all of our volumes. It calculates the dominant species by, we figured the best way to come up with that would be to do it by saw timber BA. And then the submerged species are done by trees per acre. Or actually it's done by BA as well. Excuse me, I misspoke. And then it comes over and it calculates an average for our stand info. We will calculate the management species. And then let's go to, when we move on to our monitoring, we should be in a little different one here. In our monitoring, this one is the newest program we've ran, and this is the newest data I have actually. We've got, it's actually calculating our red oak OHA. As you can see there, it's running all this stuff for us, giving us our, this area is 3 years post-treatment. So you're able to see how we've shifted the species and see what our dominant species are. You're able to see our canopy closure, our mid-story canopy, and our understory density. And then the percent grasses, forbs, bare dirt, the cavities per acre, which I think that number may be a little off, but we're working on how to get that better. Then we've got our standard volumes. And then we've also done this, which is just when we get ready to treat a stand, this is also on our other cruises as well now. When we get ready to treat a stand, this is just our removal table, and it's just saving us a lot of work and typing and punching data in, and then raw data for our plot info for the using the spatial data. Let's go back to my, all right, so there's that. So basically just an example of how some of this is being used spatially, and looking at all of our stuff. This is on BioToView WMA in Northeast Arkansas, and it's got the willow oak broke out and showing how each component falls there. And then it's got a heat map. So we are able to look and isolate places easily, looking at it spatially by building heat maps and things of that nature to look at it on the landscape. We can then go look at willow oak density, for example, or come back and look at red oak regeneration. So we can put on a map that these areas have, these are the areas we want to focus our management on. They've already got advanced regeneration, so we want to go in there and release those areas. And then here's an example of how our monitoring is shifting data and showing us how we've shifted it. In 2015, we did the standard GTR cruise at Sheffield Nelson Dagmar. And you can see that this is what the stress levels were. In 2016, we did a forest treatment on a section of that area. And we then came in and did the monitoring in 2020 on the treated area. And as you can see, we have dramatically improved that. We went from 11% no stress to 68% no stress. Slight stress stayed pretty much all the same. Dramatically reduced the moderate stress. Went from 39% heavy stress to 0% heavy stress. And so we can actually see how we shifted the health of the stand. And then the final slide I think we have here is just a chart out of the DFC manual where we are showing how we can actually answer the questions that are asked in the DFCs with actual hard data that was collected on the ground post-harvest. And that's pretty much so the end there. Stop share. David, if you want to move on to the next one, I hope I didn't ramble too much.
Sounds good, Drew. We appreciate it. So our next speaker is Jeff Denman, and he's going to cover some DFCW and the practical application on private grounds.
And get it to come up. Where does Zoom go? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Jeff. Did you find your share screen?
It came back. Got shared screen.
At the bottom. All right.
You know, you're up and running.
That's good.
All right, I'm Jeff Denman. Good to meet y'all that I haven't met. Appreciate y'all joining in on our Zoom meeting. So on private land in Mississippi Valley, of course, you see what the ownership is like. These private ownerships, they're right for managing for wildlife via DFC concepts. You know, many times one or more members are seeking information and expertise from knowledgeable and experienced professionals that can enhance their ability to observe more wildlife on their properties. And in so many ventures, it starts with a contact with an interested individual, you know, a personal contact. Landowners are seeking assistance. In a sense, they're begging to be told about DFCs for wildlife. You know, we could do presentations, just having casual conversations at meetings, field tours, lunches, get the word out. So what can one consultant do? I'm just one. So here's Arkansas. You got Little Rock here in the center, the Arkansas River running down, Mississippi River along the east side, White River through the middle here. So over the last 10 years, I've done work for about 150 private ownerships, East Arkansas, but a little bit in Central Arkansas, Southwest, Northwest, and even in Mississippi along the Mississippi River and way over here in Mississippi. Zooming into East Arkansas. Again, Little Rock, Arkansas River, Pine Bluff, and in red, you can see the properties I've written plans for. This is Biomeda Wildlife Management Area, Justin Holder Wildlife Management Area, Big Island, White River National Wildlife Refuge, Cache River Refuge, Wattensaw WMA, Dagmar WMA. Adds up to about 56,000 acres that DFCs have been written into plans, either through forest stewardship plans, which is via the USDA program through the state forestry agencies, or similar plans through private funding. Well, that's all a bunch of talk till something happens on the ground. Out of all that, about 16,000 acres have been thinned to put in a position to grow into DFCs. Makes it pretty clear that landowners don't always follow through to implement the forest plans. Now keep in mind, this is one forestry consultant on a part-time basis. I did no follow-up contact after writing the plans. I left it purely to the landowners to get in touch with me if they wanted me to help them implement a project. Some of them had their other foresters and proceeded with their project. If I was going to do this full time, I would have been doing follow-up calls, and I expect it would double or almost triple the amount of acres thinned. I just didn't have the time to put into it. So a few examples of the forests that have been put into condition to grow in DFCs on private lands. Canopy gaps are created in the overstory, just as important in the midstory, so that sunlight can reach the forest floor. You see the abundant herbaceous plants have been stimulated within just a couple of years. Browse, seeds, and low cover provided. Great for deer during the dry season. Floods about knee deep, several years out of every decade. Makes for great for duck hunting. The tree crowns have room to expand by having some growing space. More twigs equals more mass production. And amongst this low vegetation will be tree seedlings released by the heavy thinning or established by the sunlight. Here's a site that I did a variable retention improvement thinning about 15 years before this photo. So you had a dancer generation of oaks. They're more than 3 foot tall, and they became established from that previous thinning. And here the same landowner, actually the son, was having me do a subsequent thinning. And so we're removing the lower quality trees. You see some sweet gums here, marked for removal with some defect. Now to release these established regeneration of oaks. Low quality trees due to crook and poor quality crowns were marked for removal. You see the tree with crook, you see another less desirable tree in the back marked for removal, and look at the advanced regeneration of oak, just begging for some sunshine. So we include wildlife habitat while we're promoting the oak dominated forest preferred by the private landowners. Here's a multi-canopy forest with abundant advanced regeneration of oaks. About 9 years post thinning. So take a guess, how was this created? You nailed it if you said it with a partial cut. Variable retention improvement thinning. So now what do we do? Well, pure timber, wanting to grow the most oak, you would clear cut it to fully release this advanced regeneration. However, for wildlife, another heavy partial cut can release sufficient amounts of this oak while retaining trees of various sizes and ages that provides productive wildlife habitat for lots of species. Retaining various sizes also provides opportunities to keep thinning every 10 to 15 years to revitalize the wildlife habitat. And what's important to private landowners, periodic income to pay the bills. Here's a patch of no cut within that same thinning. So we have areas, as Doug spoke about, that keeps closed canopy open underneath that greatly enhances within stand diversity. So now for some action shots. So this kind of habitat we seek to create, dense understory, lots of mid-story cover and berry production, yet with tree crowns for the wildlife that will utilize the upper canopy. This heavy cover is a key to survival of young wildlife, which builds populations. And so that's the goal of DFCs, is have a portion of your landscape in this condition, other portions growing into it, and some portions have grown out of it with the heavy shade and open underneath. And this gets a lot of traction with a lot of landowners. and other conservationists. It's just announced this week, Walmart Incorporated is committing to helping protect, manage, and restore at least 50 million acres through the Walmart Foundation. That's no small piece of ground. And I think the family is receptive to some of this being in the Mississippi Valley. So we have some great allies in implementing these projects on private lands as well as public lands. We could get some more application on private lands through recruiting more consultants to provide services to the landowners. Wait for questions till at the end of the meeting.
Sounds good, Jeff. Thank you. Randy, you're next on the list.
All right, David, I'm technically challenged sometimes. Let me see what we got going.
Here we go.
You see it?
Yes, sir.
I want not so much talk about what we've done with desired forest conditions and entering stands, but more so what's the status of Arkansas's WRE forest lands and primarily our hardwood plantations. And so in doing that, first off, I need to, wanted to remind you what our goals for the program were, and it's primarily to provide habitat for migratory birds and other wetland-dependent species. So it ties in, if we don't manage our forest for that primary goal, we're not meeting our program objectives. Arkansas right now, we're number 2 in WRE, WRP enrollment with about 285,000 acres. We've been doing this about 25 years now, and most of us thought the program would never get off the ground in its early years, and here we are 25 years later trying to manage forest. We spent a lot of time and effort and money acquiring property and restoring it, and now we're in a position where our stewardship needs to step up, and we've got to get into some of these hardwood plantations and start molding them into what we want them to be. So with that, you kind of have to know where, like Jeff's picture, where these properties are located in Arkansas. And as you could see on this slide, there's the Red River Valley in the southwest. There's about 50,000 acres of easements there. Move up through the River Valley, through the White River Basin. There's easements located up the I-40 corridor on the Arkansas River. So we stretch all the way from the Missouri line to the Louisiana line, with probably 90% of those 285,000 acres falling in the Delta. This slide kind of shows the history of our acquisition and our tree planting from 96 up to 18. I haven't put 19 slides in yet. But the blue line is acres acquired, and then the green line are acres planted. And so the difference in each year is either existing forest on that tract of land or hydrology that we've put in some form or fashion, emergent marsh or moist soil units or permanent water or something. As you see early in the program's years, we planted pretty much everything that we bought, and then we kind of got scolded pretty bad back in the late 90s and started to build in putting some hydrology restoration back on tracks. And that kind of shows, that's the difference in the tops of those lines. And when you look at it in a cumulative fashion, that pretty much is our portfolio over the last 25 years. Louisiana got a jump on us because they were in the early 5-year pilot project of WRP. So they have some 30-year-old stuff now. But what's interesting here is, you know, we start looking at this and we look at the number of acres that are over certain age groups. So if we go back 20 years to 2001, 2002, somewhere in here, we're at 42,000 acres that are 20 years old. You know, a 15-year-old, we're about 92,000 acres that are 15-year-olds now. And so those forests are maturing. And one of the issues we've had as an agency is we've been very limited with foresters, and we've not spent a lot of time assessing what we have out there on the landscape in our 285,000 acres. We just, you know, we monitor them every year, and we visit with landowners, and we're on some of them, and we know what's good and we know what's failed, but we don't know, you know, in the interior of those stands, all those acres, is it performing? Is it growing like it ought to be growing? Is it moving towards our goals and our objectives? And that's kind of where we're at. And we have multiple tools that we're kind of going to start using and utilizing to do that with. Some of the work, these, you know, these are easements. Here's cotton plant here, Duval's Desark here, and then the different colors, different shades, or different ages of easements. And so we have a tool. Ron and Steve have recently completed a database where we can click on, you know, that easement, and it tells someone when that easement was established in trees, and it's pretty much just to be used. Our foresters are using it now to look to see where to go. You know, you can filter it by county and by age and say, well, here's the 3 tracks I need to go look at today, and let's go see what they look like and what's going on with them. And so it's pretty slick. The Tri-State Conservation Partnership has developed this pamphlet. It's for WRP landowners, and we get requests pretty much every week from landowners wanting us to come look at their stands and see if it's time to enter those stands and do some treatment. This is a great little 5-page document that was built after a more technical document for the foresters was built, and it's for landowners just to kind of do a judgment themselves. And so this is pretty much the first thing that we will give them. I don't know, I think we have shared it with the CDN before, Steve. I can't remember, but
That's correct, Randy.
it's just a really handy document, and we have them in our offices. This was built for the Tri-States and has all 3 states' contact information on the bottom of it. And I'd be glad to share those with any of the private lands biologists that, you know, visit with WRP, WRE landowners. We need to get these out, or we're probably going to mail them out to all of our landowners this summer. That's in the thought process. And so we're proud of that document. I wanted to bring up one other tool that has recently, we've been working with the American Farmland Trust, and we're a pilot state along with Louisiana and some other states across the country. I think there's 7, where there's some new monitoring techniques that are being used, and this is satellite imagery, half-meter resolution stuff that they've developed, and it's pretty interesting in that it shows it shows manipulations on landscape. Something has changed on that landscape, and these satellites are picking it up, and their databases they can bring it down to different confidence levels and sensitivity levels to where they can provide us maps of an easement. So this is a 1,900 acre easement in Pulaski County, and essentially it builds these heat maps where something has changed on that landscape. And so it's so tight that we can see if a tree's fallen, or if the next door neighbor came in with a chainsaw and cut firewood for the winter. This is kind of being directed towards our monitoring efforts where, and I think even with stands, we can evaluate stand conditions as whether we need to enter into them and look at them closer or not. But this is pretty slick. I thought that, you know, you see these, and then you'll go out and ground proof them. So last month, our staff and this company's a guy came in and they're testing some of this. So they went and looked, and there's some water management activities was causing these to fire up. There was some mowing up here in the north part that caused that to show up, some water standing. It's just a tool for us to know to go, and this is the first place you would go and look for potential violations or encroachments, or a tornado's come across and ruin a stand or something, or help the stand. You know, it's just that's a little tool that's coming on our screen. One of the things we talked about in a previous CDN meeting was about 3 years ago, NRCS in Arkansas, we entered into an agreement with University of Arkansas at Monticello to do some evaluation of our forest, our hardwood plantations. And so Dr. Benjamin Baps and his staff made a project out of it, and we're in our 3rd year. We've extended it a year due to some restrictions from kind of COVID movement where we couldn't get all of our data done. But so we're kind of in the last leg of some of that. And he shared these slides with me to share with y'all. The purpose of the research project was to assess our current conditions of our older easements, so that we know where we need intervention. We wanted to look at tree growth and forest health and be able to model that so that we can see if we're headed in the right direction, and whether we need to go ahead and treat, what those treatments would be. One of the objectives is to maybe to look at new prescription types. Here are the 9 counties that were selected. They did them in 3 different phases. So the Southeast Arkansas, then they moved up the River Valley, and you see the blue and the green. Those are all of the 3 sampling zones that they utilized. They spent about 2 months going through all my files here in my office, pulling planting plans and maps, and they ended up sampling 32 easements in those counties, 110 fields with 856 10th acre plots, measured almost 18,000 trees and pulled 2,500 tree cores. So the purpose of a lot of that was just, like I said, is our growth rate what it's supposed to be, and then they can take this data and model it in a few minutes what that forest should look like in 20 years, and help us, you know, kind of see where we might need to be planning to go next. There's a lot of work. They're measuring diameter, height, and bigger crown metrics that the DFCW uses are all involved. Doug Osborne is also going to have input at the end regarding those metric relationships to habitat, and so we hope to learn a lot from that. It's, like I said, it's pretty extensive, and a lot of work went into this project, and their data is just now starting to come out of it. here's 4 different counties shown with those sites, and it shows, species composition. Different reasons they show, red oaks were much more common than the white oak species. They showed some of the natural regeneration that's come in, caused a lot of sugarberry to come in. There's a lot of ash, of course, that's at risk in the green. Some of this could have been influenced by the prescriber. So I probably wrote the tree planting plans on these first 2 bars, and a different biologist wrote the plans on the second 2 bars. So we have some different composition there. They're plotting these on for stocking purposes to see if we're understocked or where we ought to be. They've only, they'll plot all of those plots to see where we stand. Some of the comparisons of the oaks that they're doing is kind of interesting. They found that the willow oak had a harder time getting up in its first 5 years, but then it outgrew the other oaks in the remaining part of that 15 years. Cherry bark was having some falls. The cherry bark line is this red line on the bottom that looks like it has had some issues with growth rate in the last couple of years. Where willow oak is taken off is the blue line. Cherry bark, nuttall's kind of just right in the middle of all of that. So it's coming up with some pretty interesting data. The thing that they have left to do is fly some drone footage and start trying to see where we're going next with, can we do aerial assessments, what that's going to look like, determine densities, basal area, composition. So we hope to learn a lot out of that project, and we're excited about getting it wrapped up soon. And with that, that's kind of where I'm going to end.
Awesome. Thank you, Randy. If you'll unshare your screen.
I don't see my unshare button again.
Should be able to just
Scroll to the bottom of the screen.
I got it up at the top. Okay. Did I get it?
Yep.
Sir. All right. With that, we're going to jump on into the Q&A section. Let's see. We've got a few comments over here. I know that Jeff Denman was helping answer some of those as the group chat was going on. Let's see. So Dan Shyman did ask that mapping changes in comparison is as in comparing imagery from previous year to current year. So Randy, I believe he was talking to you in that one. Dan, would you like to elaborate any more on that question?
Yeah, they were showing the heat map. So that heat map comparing the photo taken last year to the photo taken this year, and that's the kind of change that you're looking at. Otherwise, what is change exactly measuring?
That's right. That's correct. So what is Dan, are you asking, what is it measuring?
Yeah, what was the change measuring? What was being compared?
Well, it's sensing horizontal and vertical changes. You got me talking way out of my realm on it. But it's changes in, in pixels of that satellite imagery is so tight, and they have so they have such huge databases tied, they can see that there's something has changed. It's kind of like we were talking one day about they know when North Korea moves a gravel bar, you know, and it picks that up.
Okay, thank you.
Randy, if you don't mind me hopping in for a second here. I'm Carrie Neal. I work for Randy with NRCS. So with that imagery that they're doing, they took like 1 meter resolution imagery in 2019, and now they've went down to that half meter. So anything that's changed in that amount, if a piece of equipment is moved onto the property, they would be able to pick that up. Some of the vegetation that we saw, you know, the horizontal or vertical movement, you know, it was only mowed down like maybe 10 to 12 inches from the rest of it, and that flagged the imagery as well. So something that's pretty neat is they have 36, I believe it is, satellites that they can tap into, and they can pull this imagery. It's not really imagery, it's just like sensory type stuff. But they can go over a site, you know, pretty much once every hour if they needed to you know, really monitor some of these easements. So it just really varies on how often they are ground truthing and stuff right now as to when they're pulling it.
Thank you, Carrie.
David, I was going to mention too, it might be good, even though Jeff provided some good answers to some of these chat questions, it might be good just to put them out. And if Jeff or Duck or Drew, you know, want to elaborate, or anybody else, but with that the first question Eric Johnson asked was, what is the minimum size of a landscape? And I think Jeff kind of gave the DFCW a straightforward book answer. I don't know if there is anything more any of y'all would add to that.
Yeah, I'd add, and that's the book answer, and that was based on the minimum requirements of you know, certain species like swallowtail kite needed, you know, 10,000 acres and that kind of thing. When I think of a landscape, it depends on who I'm dealing with. So if I'm managing a WMA, then that's my landscape. If it's a 12,000 acre WMA, my landscape's 12,000 acres. If it's a 70,000 acre landscape, my landscape's 70,000 acres. If it happens to adjoin two others, my landscape might be, you know, 1,000,000 acres. But if I'm dealing with a landowner and he has 800 acres, then that's his landscape. That's how I look at a landscape. It's that bigger parcel that you're capable of managing. If you're dealing with very small landowners, then the landscape may be multiple landowners. You know, a hunting club that has a couple of 100 acres, but he's adjoined by 4 or 5 other hunting clubs, and they all have, you know, it's that same parcel of property, and you can get them all working on the same wavelength, then that's the landscape you're dealing with. Or if they're not working on the same way, at least you know what's going on in that landscape you're working on. So, I mean, 10,000 acres is a rule of thumb. That's what we always say, but it can be much larger, much smaller. It's all in, you know, your perspective. And I'll shut up.
Good stuff. Anybody else? The other question that was asked, I didn't catch who asked it, but it was relative to your comments about timber quality, I think, and removal. And they asked, Dan actually asked that question, low quality in terms of timber value or wildlife value in terms of, I think that's probably tree selection in the treatment process. And Jeff offered a really great answer, but again, just offering an opportunity to expound on that question.
Yeah, I just read Jeff's answer. It's spot on. When I was speaking about low quality in my presentation, I was talking from a timber standpoint. You know, it's always, if you have a low, when I meant a low quality overstory, and it might be time to remove that overstory, I was meaning from a timber standpoint, not necessarily a wildlife standpoint. I'm trying to improve the wildlife habitat, but I was talking from timber products.
Anybody else got any comments on quality? So Jason Milks has raised a question, and I'm just going to read that because it's a little long, but good stuff. A lot of great data collection tools described today. Once the data is collected and a treatment is recommended, what's the next hurdle to get these stands treated? We've heard today that landowner economics, forester capacity, and other challenges exist. What should be done to help address getting these plans implemented?
I'll take a stab at it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The next biggest hurdle is markets. To remove trees that are surplus to the needs of wildlife, a market is vital to be able to make it cost effective, whether it's private or public lands. And so our big markets are paper mills and other chip using facilities that can use the low quality trees that are in abundance in these stands. But these markets are in decline because of shifts in our culture and the use of paper products. So we may be shifting to having to pay to have some of these surplus trees removed or killed. And that's where partnering with things like the Walton Family Foundation that make it help alleviate the costs involved in getting change in the forest on the ground. Ideally, let market forces do it, but we have declining markets. It'll make it'll require more paying to have it done, pay to have a cutting machine or an injection crew or something, and not many landowners can economically make those investments as the payoff is a long ways off.
Good stuff. Anybody else on that one?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of it just to give an example. Because of the lack of demand for copying paper and printer paper, you've had several mills, at least in my country. We've had two Georgia Pacific mills, one in Crossett and one at Port Hudson, closed down, or Crossett's shut down or diminished their what they're taking. Port Hudson is totally shut down. Our pulpwood market basically, hardwood pulpwood market disappeared in about the last 36 months, and probably isn't going to come back anytime soon. And so what Jeff just said, starting to do some things kind of outside the box and paying to have a treatment. I just happened to luck up into a NIFWIF grant and actually paying a contractor who's a logger who doesn't have anything to do right now to run his shear for $160 an hour, and he's thinning for me. It's on a WMA where we historically have a tough time selling pulpwood because it's a little bit off the beaten path. Access is a little bit tough, and the distance to what was the mill, which is now closed, it was far. So it's always been a little problem child area, but you know, that might be the future. You know, we can still move saw timber, but to do some pulpwood treatments, we may be using non-commercial methods in place of what we've been lucky to use commercial methods for the last, 3 decades. That I think that's kind of the future. Until dirty chip operation or pellet mill or somebody pops up to have a demand for that product, we're going to be looking towards paying to have it removed from the landscape. So that's just kind of a reality. that we maybe need to start planning for and get used to.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
So Duck, when you're paying to have that pulpwood sheared down, are they just leaving that in the forest, or?
Yep,
Right.
leaving it right where it stands, right where it falls.
One thing I would add on to that too, and it's kind of rolls into it's the same fundamental problem, but just a lot of discussion in the Tri-State Partnership and within the CDNs about how do we address, developing wetland reserve easements. It looks like from a lot of the work we've been doing in conversations we've been having with both industry and technical professionals like y'all, is that what Duck's saying is a reality, and it's going to be probably 5 to 10 years even before a lot of it becomes economically valuable. So you got the combination of a limited market and ability to sell it until that time comes, and down to what Duck said. And I was out in the field with some Louisiana NRCS folks a couple of weeks ago with a logger. And basically they said, we just can't touch this economically. And we were talking about some treatments that's already being applied, and basically, and some of the work Buddy Dupuy is doing, doing a 5% removal in patch cuts. And he showed us some images of that, and we were basically weighing the economic cost. What's the most cost efficient way to come out and create diversity, structural diversity in these stands, and promote some of the things we're looking for in terms of developing them. And so that was kind of one of our conclusions. That seems to be one of the most effective ways, as Buddy's looked at it, to send a cutter out to move around and just cut small patches, identified patches of 5% of a stand. I don't know if, Duck, you got anything to add to that?
No, the only thing I'll add is it was so that treatment was non-commercial. It wasn't 5%, it was 15%. So he was cutting 15 1-acre holes per 100 acres. So it was 15%. I still would love to have it a little bit higher than that, but provided you're literally cutting it and leaving it on the ground, and that's a hard pill to swallow for a forester. That's where we're at, is 15%. That's kind of where we landed when he and I discussed it, whether we should do it or not. Yeah, that's where we're at. But that's what the prescription is right now. Group selection harvest of 1 acre, 15 per 100 acres.
On that same subject, are y'all are y'all getting a lot of blowback from the public as far as access issues and traffic? How are y'all kind of doing with that? We run into that with some public complaints when you start leaving wood on the ground. How are y'all answering those questions?
Yeah, the same way we used to answer it when they used to gripe about timber cutting, and now they call us wanting to know where we're about to cut or why we hadn't cut, because they want light on the ground. Same way. I've had a couple of we finished that project about 2 weeks ago, and I had 3 phone calls since then, and same way. Why are y'all cutting that pretty timber, just leaving it on the ground? Well, you know what I answered. I was very polite and explained to them that we're a wildlife agency trying to provide habitat for wildlife, and the pulpwood market is very poor. And the only way for us to make sure that his grandkids have deer and rabbits to chase and ducks have a place to come through the canopy this winter is to get out there and put trees on the ground. And yeah, when you do it that way, it's been okay. I hadn't had anybody go to their representative yet.
I know it's easy for me. It's easy to justify the timber sale part of it, and I have a lot of people that have a bigger issue. It seems like with the aesthetics and with the aesthetics and the ability to walk around than they do necessarily the activity.
Right.
They understand the purpose. They just don't like the result, the immediate result.
Right.
Yeah, so we're having trouble hearing you, Drew, but just to reiterate, he basically said that both the aesthetics and movement problems that are created with leaving timber in those cuts is one of the biggest gripes that AGFC is getting.
Got one question I did want to throw out to the group. Doug and Drew, y'all can probably help answer this, but I guess it's more geared towards Randy. So with the economic decline of pulpwood and the problems that y'all are seeing with getting those trees cut and getting them out, is there any validity to reducing the number of trees planted on WRE or CRP grounds? And if so, kind of what type of prescription will we be looking at, or number of trees planted or species of trees planted? Because I know on some dark WREs that they're planting cottonwoods or other trees in between rows of oaks. Would you increase the spacing and decrease the number of those, I guess, semi-undesirable trees that you're going to try to cut out as pulpwood early?
Yeah, David, we've been wrestling with this for a long time. Ever since the beginning of the program. And before George retired, he and I, we would almost get in fistfights about whether I should spend taxpayer money going in and doing exactly what we're talking about and just leave it on the ground, or let these trees continue to grow till they're marketable. And then we also have had these discussions about, should we be changing our planting plans and the way we approach reforestation efforts. And some of the cottonwood work has kind of got hot there for a while. The carbon market was driving a lot of that, and climate resiliency has now come back into the picture. And so there's some different views from a lot of different people, and everybody's got great advice on what to do. We just don't know where we're going to land yet. Our agency as a whole on the WRE, WRP landscape is now understanding where we are age-wise and age class-wise, and that we need to be spending a portion of our allocation towards stewardship, and that can be part of it. I think one of the things I asked that I'm looking forward with the joint venture is when is buying enough that we can, instead of trying to continue to acquire easements, use those funds to improve habitat. And where is that? And so there's just a lot of discussion. David, I'm not a forester, so whether changing a planting plan or changing spacings, different states do it different ways. They've gone from 8x8s to 10 to 10s and 12 to 12s and different ins and outs, cluster plants and leaving gaps, and depends a lot where you are and what it is. And so I look forward to any advice anybody wants to give.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and I'm definitely not a forester either. But I just, I hate to spend federal dollars going out and planting these trees and then turn around in 8, 10, 15 years or whatever and doing a quote unquote pulpwood cutting and just laying these down and leaving them out there on WRE ground or something like that. And then, you get backlash from the landowner. I just didn't know if there was some way we could do a reduction in planting or whatever and try to alleviate that some on the front end. Like I said, I am definitely not a forester, so I'm kind of talking over my head, but this is a good group to ask that question to.
Doug can probably answer it better than I can, but I guess from my standpoint, a lot of the spacing is designed to get a tree that will grow up and make a quality formed tree at some point in time during its life. And if you spread them out too far, you're never going to get the lower limb droppings, and you'll end up with basically a bunch of yard trees with great big giant crowns and no height and no form or basically no value timber wise one day. And Doug can probably elaborate on that a lot better than I can.
Yeah, I'll say this. What you said is absolutely true, and I'm talking about our agency, Louisiana Department of Fisheries, and the property that we've restored over the last 40 years, 30 years. But we always planned we planned on 302, 12 by 12 for the longest time. Then we went to 435, which is a 10 by 10, trying to get better stem quality. We've come full circle. Buddy Dupuy's in charge of our reforestation program, and he's, after looking at old plantations, our oldest plantations, and looking at a lot of WRP easements, he's convinced that 12 by 12, 302 is probably a better way to go. At 435, you end up, it closes up really quick. And it's good for stem development and stem quality, but it closes up really quick, and you're left with pretty crappy wildlife habitat for a very long period of time until it's merchantable and you can get in there, or you decide to do something pre-merchantable. 302, it's kind of a happy medium. We found, looking at anything that was done with lower densities in 302, then the stem quality suffered. So, that's your happy medium. You have to find it, and we landed on 12 by 12. That's for us in Louisiana on our heavy clay soils. That's kind of where we're at now. And to answer the question, or to help answer the question, there are some folks that may be planting on a lower density than 302, but I would warn heavily against it, because you may end up with yard trees, and you're already having trouble as a market selling pulpwood if you don't at least let your stems have the chance, your residuals, those ones that are going to be there to saw timber. If you don't give them a chance to become saw timber, then you're never going to have any type of commercial treatments in the future. So, take it for what it's worth. 302 is where we're at on that for, pretty good trade-off. And then as far as, and this is just my opinion, right? My opinion means it's worth about as much as y'all are paying for it. But on WRE easements, if the money's there, grant money or federal money, whatever, the monies are there to just lay trees on the ground. Those trees are being laid on the ground to improve the wildlife habitat, which is why the easement is there in the first place, right? I mean, if the landowner gets upset that you're cutting down trees, but they're not going to a mill, what the hell? The easement's for wildlife. The whole reason we're putting those trees on the ground is put light on the ground to improve the wildlife habitat, and of course to move those residuals on up, free them up some growing space. So that's just my take on it. But like I said, I'm not a landowner. I don't have a WRE easement, and so just my opinion. Thank you.
Just throwing something out there. Just thinking on David's point. Could you, what are y'all doing on as far as tree composition and as far as species composition, and doing that and using the different tree species composition to help alleviate that problem and get some stuff that will trainer species, but the oaks can outgrow and get up above it?
For the most part, everybody battles it out. And certain trees you're gonna, win out on a short haul, and some of them are gonna, like your hickories, they take a long time. They put on roots for a long time, and about 10 or 15 years after they're planting, that's when they go ahead and make their jump. And oaks get out there pretty quick. I just learned from that data that willow oak is a little bit behind, your water oaks and cherry barks. Not surprising that the cherry bark's playing out now, because cherry bark's so susceptible to flooding, whereas he might get out there if you get a decade of dry times, but we find that our cherry bark, anytime we get any water on these properties, we lose our cherry bark. But to answer that question, of that 302, we make it that normal mix of oak, a little bit of whatever hickory is that you want to put, water hickory or sweet pecan, whatever one needs to be there. On low ground, it's going to be bitter pecan. On higher ground, sweet pecan. We're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 oaks. your ash and your elm. That's what makes up the 302, really. We're going to grab some other stuff that miscellaneous, and it'll be in little pockets or little orchards and those kind of things. But we don't really mix our mayhaw and hawthorn and mulberries and those anymore. We put those in little orchards. So either if we get success, we got an orchard of soft mass, and if we get a failure, then we have a pocket that, you know, a skip, you know, no survival, little briar thicket. Cottonwood, we only add the cottonwood. It is on our WMAs. We only put cottonwood on, you know, on those properties that have a little bit of commerce soil close to the river, ridge swale, where cottonwood, you know, you would expect it to be. Same with sycamore. And in that case, that'll be part of that 302. But I mean, yeah, you can play with that species mix. Heck, I know the way it is now at nurseries, it seems like it's harder to find the mix. So it's hardly you don't have the problem. For the longest time, we didn't plant enough diversity in tree species, and then it seems like we got in the habit of, you know, planting 14, 18, and 20 species. Well, we found it very hard the last 3 or 4 years to find those miscellaneous species. So now we're back to, you know, our wish list is maybe 6 or 8, and anything more than that is just lagniappe. I know I didn't answer it, but I'm letting you know what we do and how we do it. We don't use those ones that we know are going to be poor performers and stick them in the 302 batch, knowing that they're not going to make it. They might just train for a little while, because I find those trees don't really train. A trainer tree is highly competitive for 8 or 10 years. You know, so it's, as long as you're mixing your oaks and you know, they're training each other. If you got, you know, some ash and some elm mixed in with it, all the better. So.
Duck, one thing I was going to jump back on, you commented earlier about state or federal. I think you said the funding source for some of those treatments, but there, you know, as long as a landowner gets a CUA, of course, and our CS is an agreement, there are certainly instances where the landowner so badly wants to, you know, have their habitat improved, they're willing to pay for that treatment. So that's just a point I was going to throw out there for the rest of the group, if they weren't aware that sometimes landowners are willing to pay the cost of doing that non-commercial treatment.
Doug, there was one thing I wanted to ask real quick. You know, when we're talking about species mix, I know that some of the plantings that I've been on, we mixed in a lot of sweet gum, persimmon, and sugarberry for some of your soft mass, and some elm as well. But are y'all still planting green ash on some of the easements that are going in Louisiana?
We laid off of the green ash. Of course, green ash becomes still a part of it, because you know, it's wind disseminated so well. But no, because of, you know, emerald ash borer and all the researchers I talked to, although I haven't witnessed it yet, you know, I mean, it's still, when it's not on your WMAs, you know, you kind of think of it as something that pie in the sky. And but everybody I talk to is drop dead serious. They say there's no stopping it. It's coming. It's gonna knock them out. We'll have a lot of young ash. You know, it's gonna stump sprout back, get up to a certain size, die back. So yes, to answer your question, we stopped planting green ash for sure. Sweet gum, you know, we plant that on some of our higher sites. We don't plant it on the heavy clays. I always plant red maple, try to always plant a little American elm. Sugarberry, it all depends. Certain properties, there's not much sugarberry there, so we do plant sugarberry if we can get it. Some properties, we have a lot of sugarberry, so it will naturally, you know, birds are going to carry it, and it's going to get into any plantation we plant. So sugarberry is kind of a case by case. And sweet gum, definitely, if it's you know, some, you know, tensile soils or better, then we plant sweet gum. If it's those sharky clays, then we don't plant any sweet gum.
The Giles, Arkansas, we're not planting any green ash any longer.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I knew, you know, in Mississippi, my coworker told me they'd stopped, you know, years ago, but I didn't know if that was the same across the board or not.
So Jason, I don't know if you want to comment on your question, but I'll repeat it. Jason Miltz asked, curious what this group thinks about how fluctuating interest in carbon could influence decisions, good or bad. And I'm assuming that's relating to treatment, not, planning and stocking. But if I'm incorrect about that, Jason, you can clarify.
Yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt the conversation. I think it's a great discussion. But yes, I would say from my perspective with the Nature Conservancy and working up and down the valley, it appears there's increasing interest in carbon, even though it's a super low market. And I'm curious how this group thinks that interest in carbon is either a good thing or a bad thing with respect to getting, DFCs implemented. If we see a, increasing in growth rate after treatments, does that stimulate, some carbon sequestration that might be able to pay for that, sort of treatment or somewhere down the road? I'm just curious, just noodling on it, because I have a lot of people asking me about, how they can get trees in the ground, but here we are talking about, well, reducing our tree stands and not being able to do, the work that needs to be done in them anyway. So just curious what others' thoughts are.
I'll jump in there, and I am ignorant when it comes to carbon market. I know enough that I'll probably say something wrong, but I guess my take on it is, on easements, of course, that's an easement, but on straight up private land, I see it as a great thing. It's another avenue for a landowner to get payment to keep forests. I don't know how that would work on WRE. As far as the treatments, and this is where I know there's like 3 different criteria, or there's 3 avenues you can go when you're selling carbon, and one of them is improving that stand, keeping it forest and improving that stand and moving the stand towards saw timber. And so even if it's non-commercial type treatments, that's still going to be beneficial and allowed, even though in the carbon trade realm of things. And I'm gonna stop there because I'm probably going to get really messed up, because I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to carbon. Something I'm going to have to start learning. I kind of gave up on it because around 2011, 2012, it kind of went bust, and I thought we wouldn't have to worry about it. But now it's definitely seems like it's coming back. And Forest Source, I got it sitting on my desk right now. I just hadn't read it. There's like 5 articles about carbon. So it's definitely I think this next wave of carbon interest is that wave might make it all the way to the beach. I feel.
Makes me think that, maybe not immediately, but in the next 12 to 18 months, we might want to think about trying to focus at least a component of a CDN meeting around that topic and see if we can bring in 1 or 2 folks and can give, kind of lay it out. So, because I think most folks have a general understanding, but not a real well-grounded understanding of how that stuff works and how it might work into the future.
Was that a question for me, Steve?
No, it was just a statement.
Thank you.
Unless you want to make it into a question and answer it.
I'm not sure I do. I think the minds on this call though are that circling around the same things I see as well. I see interest growing. I see interest growing in policy changes that will make carbon more valuable. And if that happens, then I think you will see a greater interest in both reforestation and interest in management for carbon, and whether or not that matters, or whether or not that influences our ability to do DFC on existing stocks, good or bad. It really does get into a lot of variables that I don't think anybody can predict, but I just wanted to throw it out there for discussion.
Steve, Dan's put up another question there.
With a growing interest in pollinators, what could be done to incorporate additional butterfly host plants such as pawpaw, toothache tree, redbud into existing or new stands? You didn't fire anybody up with that question, Dan. Jeff's gonna answer.
I'll take a stab at it. In existing stands, when you have abundant sunlight, first couple of years, you get abundant herbaceous response, and we see the pollinators just fog into these canopy gaps, utilizing all the native flowering plants that come in. So disturbance again is the key to provide good abundant habitat for pollinators, which for ornithologists is really just bird food. In new stands, it'd be somewhat more of a challenge unless you get a large enough canopy gap, such as if they're cutting out an acre, either pre-commercially or through commercial means. You will again get the response of the seed bed and get the herbaceous growing up that the pollinators are utilizing. And when I say a new stand, I'm talking about one 15 years old. I'm not active in the reforestation field, so I have to let someone else speak up for a fresh plantation. Do you get much herbaceous coming up with the planted trees that attract the pollinators?
Jason Milks weighed in and said that he did think Duck's orchard concept is a pretty cool approach and maybe an opportunity to deliberately increase pollinator habitat and probably incorporate some of those trees Dan identified. That's my ad.
Yeah, exactly. And that's if of course, you got a blank slate, open canvas, you can add whatever species are appropriate for that site for pollinators. But why we went to the orchard concept was when we mix those species, we lose them. So we started lumping them into orchards. It's a little bit tougher on contractors. You got to grab, his hand planting crew, 2 guys, and give them the bags that go in that little orchard, put some pin flags out and say, those go here, and then keep the rest of them that are planting your regular mix out of those little holes. But one good supervisor, and it can be done easily. And for pollinators, yeah, what Jeff said is true. Early on, you're going to have a lot of herbaceous native stuff, pollinator food out there. It's down the road. Those orchards will allow you to have some nice, whatever you want, acre, 2, 3, 4, whatever size you want these to be. They're going to be much lower growing. And you'll hold on to that pollinator habitat for much longer.
David, are you with us? And I guess I would say, has any more questions? Good, really good discussion and exchange.
Yeah, I'm still here. I was just giving them a second to see if anybody had something else come up.
Further answer Dan's question a little bit. In Arkansas, we've recently entered some contracts to do a bunch of pollinator work on existing easements, but we're going to do it with fire, native warm season grasses, and not, woody plantings. And I'm like Duck. We've ever since for the last 20 some odd years, we've been orchard planting plum and everything else that we could that needs to be that way. I think the more that those people on the ground doing the tree planting with the species that you've ordered and prescribed, understand where they need to go and how they need to go is the most important concept, and spend some time with those guys.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Steve, do you see anything else that's coming up?
No, Jason was just saying great discussion, complimenting the group. One thing I would add, David, as you move to close out, I think is this is recorded, and so we will try to convert it into a small enough file size that we can serve it from the joint venture website. We'll coordinate with the speakers to see about accessibility to PDFs for the presentations as well. So our plan will be to get all that stuff served up on the joint venture website, and then get that link out to everybody in case you are interested in the specific, looking back at any of the specific information, or are obviously sharing it out with others. So that'll be forthcoming, may be a few weeks, but we'll work on getting that out to y'all as quickly as we can.
Sounds good. Well, everybody, I want to thank y'all very much for getting on. We went a little over 2 hours, but I'm not going to apologize for that, because I feel like we had a very, very informative and educational meeting here. But with that, we'll wrap it up and say goodbye.